Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This time we're diving into the world of elite athletics with a fascinating research paper on Olympic shot putter Reese Hoffa's career.
And this isn't just any research paper. It's co-authored by Hoffa and his longtime coach, Don Babbitt.
Wow, so we get both the athlete's and the coach's perspective, which you said is pretty rare, right?
Incredibly rare. It's like a backstage pass to a champion's journey.
I like that, a backstage pass.
Oh.
So, for our listeners today, are we hoping to pick up some training tips or maybe just curious about how an athlete like this trains over decades?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, wouldn't you say? This paper, it's called A Longitudinal Examination of the Throwing Career of Reese Hoffa. And honestly,
Yeah.
don't let that title scare you away. It's surprisingly engaging.
Okay, good to know. So where does it start?
It starts right at the beginning, Hoffa's early days in college, transitioning to that heavier shot put used in senior competitions. Turns out, even future Olympians have their, awkward phases.
Uh-huh. Don't we all? What kind of awkward phase are we talking about with Hoffa?
Well, he had this habit of almost hitting it big, the kind of throws that make you gasp, but they kept landing outside the sector lines.
Ouch. All that work and it doesn't even count. That's got to be demoralizing.
Exactly. And the paper does a fantastic job breaking down what was going on. They figured out it was a flaw in his initial turn, throwing off his balance and consistency.
So kind of like a golfer with a hitch in their swing.
Yeah.
That one little thing throws everything off.
Perfect analogy. And to correct it, they actually studied other shot putters, even how they use their feet differently.
Wow, so they were already thinking analytically about technique, even back then. Not just throw harder, but throw smarter.
Precisely. And this is where the coach's insight is so crucial. They weren't just pushing Hoffa to his physical limits, they were constantly analyzing and refining how he moved to maximize the power he already had. That's huge.
Absolutely. It's about working smarter, not just harder. Makes you wonder, how many of us are stuck in inefficient patterns in our own work just because we haven't stopped to really analyze what we're doing, right?
All the time. And this whole theme of efficiency, it continues into Hoffa's training regimen. Now, prepare to be surprised here. They had him throwing year-round.
Wait, really? Even in the off-season?
Mm.
I figured rest would be crucial, especially for a sport that's so physically demanding.
You'd think so, right? But their logic was all about maintaining muscle memory. It wasn't about heavy lifting in the off-season, but consistent movement to keep those grooves ingrained.
Fascinating. So it was less about building new muscle and more about, keeping those finely tuned movements familiar.
Exactly. They wanted to minimize the time Hoffa spent finding his rhythm each season. It's like a musician practicing scales, not the song, but the underlying skill.
Okay, now that is clever. I'm seeing a real focus on consistency and quality over raw intensity with these guys.
You're catching on quickly. And it gets even more interesting. They also adjusted the weight of the shot put based on his fatigue level. Later when tired, heavier as he recovered.
So even in training, they prioritized quality of movement over just pushing through fatigue.
They knew that pushing too hard when you're tired, it leads to bad habits. Instead, they wanted those perfectly executed movements, even if it meant adjusting the weight.
That makes a lot of sense. It almost sounds like something you could apply to other areas of life. Instead of powering through when we're exhausted, we should adjust the weight of the task.
Now you're thinking, this paper is about so much more than just shot put. It's about understanding the principles of peak performance and how to adapt them to your own situation.
It's easy to forget athletes are human. Fatigue, recovery, we all deal with that.
Absolutely. And the paper really gets into those challenges later in Hoffa's career, when he's in his prime, right? It wasn't just about training harder, it was smarter, especially as his body changed.
So what changed in their approach as he hit those peak performance years?
They started focusing on the connection between his body weight and how high he could jump, his vertical jump. They wanted him heavier, more mass, more power.
Makes sense, but I wouldn't think those two are so related in shot put.
Yeah.
I think raw strength was more important than how high you can jump.
And that's what's fascinating. They weren't just chasing a number on the scale. They tracked how weight changes impacted his explosiveness, his vertical jump.
So find the sweet spot where weight helped his explosiveness, not worked against it.
Exactly. And get this, to achieve that, they removed powerlifting exercises from his routine. You'd think those would be essential, right? Snatch, clean, push press, gone.
Whoa, seriously. Those are like powerlifting 101. Why on earth would they do that at the peak of his career?
It's counterintuitive, but they were in tune with his body. Hoffa was having back issues. Those exercises were too much.
So they sacrificed some raw power to protect him long term. And optimized for the specifics of shot put.
Right. It's not just power, it's the right kind of power. They realized those moves weren't translating to throwing distance efficiently, and they were risky.
That's a lesson for anyone. Sometimes, letting go of what we think we should do, it's the smartest move for long-term success.
Couldn't agree more. And you know what stayed constant? The squat. Throughout his whole career, even as they changed other things.
Interesting. I wouldn't have thought of squats as central to shot put. What made them so important?
It's that foundational lower body strength, that base for power from the ground up, the bedrock supporting everything else.
Makes sense. Like building a house, strong foundation before the fancy stuff.
Exactly. And a great analogy for anything, right? Mastering the fundamentals unlocks true mastery.
Absolutely. So we've covered training. But the paper also talks about the toll of international travel, especially as Hoffa got older, right? What kind of impact did that have? Yeah, and it's easy to forget what all goes into that. We think, oh, quick flight for a competition. But it's not, is it? Those are long trips, time zones, the pressure.
It all adds up. And as Hoffa got older, that recovery time, it just took longer. They had to be picky about which competitions he did, quality over quantity.
Smart, but tough for an athlete who's used to going all out all the time, I imagine. How do you handle that shift?
Well, and the paper mentions this. Hoffa himself seems to look back with some regret because, you see, he started his coaching academy while he was still competing.
Oh, right. The Hoffa Throws Academy. I remember that. Did they think it actually hurt his performance?
They don't say it outright, but the implications there. Like, they had the physical training down, but that responsibility, the shift to mentoring, building something new, it might have taken away from those tiny margins that make or break you at that level.
Wow. It really shows how much focus it takes to stay at the top. In anything, even something positive like coaching, there can be trade-offs.
It's a balancing act for sure. We think about the physical demands, but this paper shows the mental side's huge too, that constant push for improvement.
Makes you wonder if late career struggles, it's not just the body. Maybe it's the energy it takes to stay at that peak for so long.
Something to think about. For anyone listening who's striving for that high level, don't underestimate the mental energy it requires.
So important. This has been eye-opening, from Hoffa's technique to the strategy behind his training, even the mental side of it all. A lot to unpack.
We really went deep, didn't we? It's amazing what's in a single research paper when you really dig in.
It really is. So, for our listeners, what's the one big takeaway you hope they walk away with today?
Self-awareness and constant adaptation. Hoffa and his coach, they didn't follow the rules. They found what worked best for him, even if it meant unconventional choices.
Well said. That's something we can all use no matter what we're striving for. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. Until next time.